All right, Walrus, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing well. I'm coming to you live from a hotel room here. So hopefully my audio will be okay for everyone listening.
It sounds great on my end, and I have recorded plenty of shows in unorthodox places, so I can't blame you for that. So I actually found your stuff relatively recently through Wingle or Vingle, who I've interacted with a decent amount, and
He gets
I
around a
really
lot, doesn't he?
I know he's everywhere, right? I keep trying to invite him on
Yeah.
the show, and somehow he keeps getting out of it. But and what really kind of drew me to your work was actually your work on New Atheism. You've done a series so far on Harris and Dawkins, correct?
Yes. Along again, I'm gonna shout out as always my co-host Ludwig Path, who is my partner in crime on this. He's excellent at digging out all of the weirdest quotes from these people.
And I will say I've been very impressed with how well researched your stuff is. It's in a market that's kind of saturated with podcasts. Yours is well worth anyone's time, so I recommend that. But before we get into kind of the meat of the discussion I wanted to happen today, I've just got a question, which is how did you end up, being kind of a right winger on the internet, right? Like what drew you here?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's not a question I get asked too often, which meant that I'm gonna have to think about it for a moment. But it starts, I suppose, with the family, right? I mean, I come from a home which has displayed a lot of conservative values, so of course, within the liberal framework that we live in, but traditional gender roles, etc., etc. And it got to the point where, I used to joke with friends in high school who, due to modernity, I suppose, all come from broken homes in some form or another. That I'm the weirdo in the group because I like hanging out with my parents, right? Um, do you want me to do pretty much the timeline of my radicalization? Because I
No,
think I
I
have it
do. I'm
mapped out in my
interested.
head. Yeah, sure. I suppose if you wind the clock back to, let's say, 2008, first Obama term. Um, At that point, I'm a full-on Obama supporter, and then again, I'm also a middle schooler probably, which means that I was also a raging new atheist. um, and if you progress that to 2012, I'm a bit older, and we're in the Mitt Romney Obama election campaigns. I'm starting to realize that something is a bit fishy. As some of the things that you read in the news doesn't always line up with what I feel is reality. So I start caring a bit more about politics, about philosophy, and then get out your bingo cards, people, and you can chalk up a Gamergate, um, which sort of compounds this. Um, and I'll shout out Carl Benjamin Sargon of Akkad. I've always joked that if it wasn't for him ranting about video games 10 years ago, I wouldn't be here today. That really started because of the way culture works in the GAE. The woke stuff really came from America. So I didn't really get exposed to it before Gamergate. And Gamergate was sort of the only culture in which I was exposed to it. So I think I caught on a bit early compared to a lot of my peers locally. So after that, I start caring even more, and as probably a lot of young men do, I get really into libertarianism. That's gonna that system's gonna solve all of this if we just follow this model. It's all gonna work out fine. Um, and to top that off, I've always had an interest in economics. So my views in economics are quite naturally Austrian, which fit nicely with the libertarianism. And I ended up following a channel called Academic Agents, who posted a lot of good economic videos in short form. And I suppose if you fast forward to 2015, all of the insanity around Trump, combined with the growing sphere of dissident online right-wing personalities, has sort of introduced me back then to so many new ideas that are uh, sort of changing the way I look at the world, to the point where libertarianism isn't really an option anymore. And after the whole Trump era, 2016 onwards, and with the most popular president of all time, Joe Biden, COVID, all of this, I mean, it's not possible to be a libertarian anymore, I feel. And compound that with all the literature I've been able to discover that I wouldn't have otherwise if it wasn't for this uh, community of frog posters, I suppose.
I very
So
much know what
that's
you
been my
mean.
journey, I think, in very short bullet points.
I know what you mean, and to a certain extent, I feel like mine is very much similar. The only odd thing about it is that I actually, when I say I discovered Sargon of Akkad in university, I mean that I was taught a Gamergate class in university as a
Oh,
college
really?
freshman. Yeah, I've said this before, but this is just kind of a funny aside. So I went to school for. Sorry, give me a second. My roommate's cat is having
Yep.
a heart attack.
Yeah, no, Gamergate classes weren't something that I
Sorry,
ever had to endure.
I should also clarify. I did not mean a literal heart attack. My roommate's cat is fine. He's just
No,
being
of
loud.
course.
But anyway, but what happened is that I went to school for finance, and so when I was signing up for freshman classes, I saw game theory, and naturally I assumed, oh, economic game theory, right? Like that'll be useful. And little did
Yeah.
I know, I got bamboozled into a critical theory of video games class. And so I found Sargon of Akkad because I'm being taught in a college setting at no at some great expense to myself about like VidCon drama and all of this stuff. And I'm like,
Right.
well, without being too direct, I hate you. So whoever you hate, that must be my friend. And so that's how I found Sargon, which is a very odd way to kind of like in a very like Zoomer-esque, like devoid of context way, find your way into Gamergate.
Yeah, falling backwards into the Gamergate debate, sort of.
Right, exactly. So I'm curious. You mentioned before that you spent some time as a new atheist. Was that just kind of natural teenage rebellion, or was there some specific thing that kind of drew you to those thinkers?
I think it was, you say natural teenage rebellion. I think uh, that's very true. It's not something I'm today very proud of intellectually. I really sort of drank the Kool-Aid, in a way that only a smug 13-year-old boy can do. um, and I'd hang out at atheist subreddits and fight with people on 4chan and listen to Richard Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens, um, which means that the series we've done on some of these people have been, on a personal level, very entertaining to me, um, because of that.
It's interesting to me because I at kind of a roughly similar time, because I'm a few years younger than you, is I grew up in the American Bible Belt. I'm from the city that Jerry Falwell had his church in, right? So that should tell you the kind of
Okay,
the
yeah,
tenor of where I'm from. And went to Jesus camp, went to charismatic churches. And so oddly enough, I was also exposed to this, but I mean to the point where I was, they would sit us down and have us watch Ken Ham videos, but kind of like seriously, like this is someone you should pay attention to. And
right.
so I even remember as a kid not being particularly convinced by it. I was like, well, this seems like trash, and thankfully I was kind of exposed to, through schooling, kind of a more scholastic version of the, kind of the Christian tradition. But it is still a like an oddly nostalgic thing for me because I can say I never watched the New Atheists. I never found them compelling, but I did interact with them quite a bit. Kind of again, much like how I interacted with Sargon at first, kind of by seeing their mirror image. in kind of that like late Bush, early Obama period of time.
Yeah. Yeah, I was really on the track towards the, the Christians are keeping us from, what's the phrase, luxury space communism. Um, and I think I have my father to thank for that. He's always been very good at challenging my ideas whenever I'd come home with sort of a new perfect solution for the universe. He wouldn't be condescending or demanding that I'd conform to his views. He'd just, do the Socratic method and ask me questions until I got annoyed that I didn't have an answer, and go look it up myself, and that made me usually realize that I'm being an idiot. And
There's a certain art to that I think is helpful, because I had figures in my own life who kind of did the same thing, and that feeling of kind of realizing that you're, to use an Americanism, kind of like intellectually like over your own skis, so to speak, is
yes.
it's not a good feeling, but it's one that I think is very, very important for like kind of,
Hmm.
mildly intelligent, precocious teenagers to basically realize like you're still an idiot. You don't know how to rule the world at 14.
Yes. And I might be a bit shameful admitting this, but it took until, Jordan Peterson to sort of help me reappreciate the potential of religion. But from that point in like 2014 or whatever, 2015, uh, it was a whole new world basically. Uh,
No, I know what you
Possibilities.
mean. And I realize there's kind of this trend on our side of things to just, like endlessly dog on Jordan Peterson, because to a certain extent he is kind of a like an intellectual cul-de-sac. But I also think that, and again, because I'm a little bit younger, I kind of hit him a little bit later. But also he was kind of the like the primer to a certain extent that I needed on certain ideas. So for you, right, it was the importance of religion, and for me it was very much that kind of idea that like you are not smart enough to rule the world, right? Like you legitimately don't deserve to be in charge. You're like
Mhm.
you're essentially an unemployed, like overweight, college freshman, watching the Joe Rogan podcast in his dorm. Like
Yeah.
maybe you deserve to be there. And look, fair enough. I realize that's not the most like groundbreaking piece of advice, but I think it's an
It's
essential one. And
advice
I
that a
don't,
lot of men aren't getting today.
no,
I
definitely.
like to say that Jordan Peterson taught many men a lot of things that their fathers should have told them. But due to the way our society is structured these days, they never get the chance to.
Right. And I also think that there's something to be said. And there's this trend in our broader circles that I find kind of frustrating. And it's the idea that, like, well, once someone's ideas have been absorbed, you can kind of look back and make fun of them because, oh, we're already past it, whoever we is.
Yeah, you got to
But
hunt the next based opinion, so everything else is cringe now.
right, exactly. And you've seen the same thing happen pretty recently to Moldbug. And look, like I agree. I think everyone agrees. A lot of his, his more recent, like since he came back, his work has not been up to what he used to make. But people always act like this, like, oh, you can just go from, Ben Shapiro to Evola in 24 hours. And like, okay, maybe someone can, but I'm gonna go ahead and say, like, if you handed me, like Evola or Schmidt, straight after, watching, Ben Shapiro owns the Libtard 7, I,
Yeah, it's
it wouldn't fit into your brain, you know?
no, you're not going to be able to get through a revolt against the modern world in a month and then sort of just know how all of, all of the esotericisms of that way of viewing the world works. It's a process
Right.
to
And I
get
think
there.
that
And
Oren McIntyre is pretty good on this when he basically says, like, look, just because you've heard something before doesn't mean everyone else has. And not everything needs to be kind of eternally approaching this like vanishing point of like based right wing esoterica. Like, don't get me wrong,
yeah,
that's important. People need to kind of be pushing the boundaries, but this kind of, it's like a weird inversion of like the Trotskyite eternal revolution, if you see what I mean.
yes, yes. You always got to flank from the right somehow. You can't just
Right.
agree to. to disagree or build up an analysis that you're both that or that many of you are in agreement of. Someone has to be more based than someone else.
Right. And to me, I guess it's kind of a product of, having essentially like a bunch of internet autists. I say that somewhat
I was going to
lovingly
say it, yeah.
as an internet autist, right? But it's almost this like, and you see this is, I guess, kind of like to go back to, to kind of some older ideas in like, Western thought, which is like, there is kind of a golden mean. And I don't mean to say that in kind of the centrist way of like, like, oh, the exact geometric mean is the perfect way to, determine any conflict. But like, there are certain things which are good in and of themselves. Like you could just maximize them endlessly. But with other things, like obscurity is a good one. It's like, look, like some things are obscure because they're not very good. Just just
Right.
because it's rare and hard to find does not make it inherently good. And it's kind of this weird, like, I don't know, obsession with being a subculture that I don't think is particularly healthy.
I mean, I think it happens with a lot of subcultures, and you mentioned autism, and I know it's a bit of a meme word online. I like to use masculine energy as a replacer, um, mostly because it gets away with the connotation of how autistic people operate. I think it's more just this is just how men are. We like we like doing this sort of battle royale, Thunderdome style of intellectual uh, battling, and forge the best idea out of the crucible of online podcasts or something. And don't get me wrong, it leads to some very good ideas, and I think it leads to Western civilization. But at some point, you have to do and not just debate.
That's well said. And I guess to me, this is not the most important point. It's just something I kind of find, personally irritating past a certain point. So I've got another question to kind of circle back around to what we were saying before I, launched this on this digression, which is I kind of understand how the new atheist movement like fit into the American context, right? Like there was this kind of cadre of, extremely
Mm,
religious legacy Americans, and it seemed almost like, well, I can understand why kind of the powers that be would want to kind of take a hit out on those people, so to speak. Like they were enemies of the regime. I get it. But did that same framework fit into kind of Norwegian culture? Like did it make sense, or was it kind of a pure cultural import with no context locally?
that specific one actually made a lot of sense. Um, it's There are a lot of things that don't map one to one, like say African American slavery and like BLM stuff. That always falls a bit flat whenever some local. When I say local, that's pretty much only in the capital. Uh, cell, I should call it, arranges like a protest. No one really believes in it because there's just no precedence and no credence to it. Um, but when it comes to the specifically the fundamentalist Christian thing, it certainly did, but it doesn't exist anymore. It really doesn't. That the state church is a shadow of what it was. Um, but I would argue that the UK has been just as influential on our culture in that sense as the US has. There's sort of like a rule of thumb saying that we're 15 years behind the US and we're 5 years behind the UK politically and culturally. Now, I'd argue that gap has probably lessened quite a bit in the past 10 years. It feels like things that happened a year ago in the US are happening here now. But someone like, let's say, Tony Blair uh, has really done a number on Norwegian politics, for example. Everyone's a Blair copy, for example. Um,
So
I'm not sure if that answers your question.
no, it does. And this is a question I'm genuinely interested in, and I don't mean to be kind of like flippant or disrespectful by it, but how much of Norwegian politics is directly related to Norway, and how much of it is kind of responding to signals and trends from kind of like the wider world?
Do you mean the wider world as in the Americanisms
Yes, that's maybe a
or
better way to
general
say it, like the
politics?
GAE. So
Ah,
not
right.
obviously there's some stuff that would be like hypothetically like normal international relations, things that would happen in any era, trade disputes and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
like that's normal state stuff. And then, but I'm more speaking like things like, you know, BLM riots in a country that's 99%
yeah,
white, things like that.
yeah. It as I said, it does, well, riots. That's putting it,
I should have said
quite strong.
normally when you say protest, you
Protests.
mean riot. I mean
I
legitimately
mean,
protests in this
a bunch
context.
a bunch of college-age white girls got together in Oslo for a day and chanted something about slavery, right? That's what
Right,
happened, and it
right.
felt very strange.
Those
Because
terms
none
are
of us
equivocal
have,
in the US, not everywhere else.
yeah, right. But of course, we're on the periphery of the empire, so our politics aren't necessarily as dictated, I suppose, as other nations. There's some wiggle room for, as long as you follow the general winds of change, whatever you do within that is, it's okay. Um, but you do get there's a strange phenomenon that happens in places like this, and there's probably a cool word for it. Speaking of obscurity and esotericism, but I don't know it. But when a nation sort of on the fringes, like we are, say Finland or Sweden or Norway, for something like that, and they're on the fringe of the empire, and they sort of want to show allegiance and loyalty, they have a tendency to overdo it, sort of to make sure that, look at me, I'm being a good boy, right?
Well, that's the Canada
Um,
effect, right? Like Canada
yeah,
essentially
right.
is
The
just a
Canada
really
effect, I
try
guess, is the
hard blue state.
yes. So it leads to strange moments where countries like ours will be quote unquote based on certain issues, and then totally go way too far in signaling on other issues, um, to show their support.
That makes sense, and it's always something that I don't know. At least I find odd, and to kind of go back to why to our our conversation before we started rolling, it's why despite quite loving my country and like loving the place where I'm from, like look, I'm very much a somewhere type of person. Like I'm here till I die, but I look at kind of the European context and I can't help myself but kind of feel in sympathy with like anti-American sentiments in Europe. I'm like, yes, keep going, kick us out, please. And it is that odd. Like it's just strange to me to see and I don't say this in any sort of belittling way, but to see kind of a state which is almost like run for the opinion of another state, if that makes sense.
You were very much a vassal state, right? And credit where credit is due, a lot of our politicians have realized that, and in a sort of geopolitical strategy sense, what specifically Norway has been good at is producing people that can easily fit into international organizations and positions of power, which allows us to at least have a say in things.
Right, kind
And
of
I'm
punch
talking
above
about
your
people
weight, so
like
to speak.
right. I'm talking about people like Stoltenberg, who is the leader of NATO. He was the former prime minister and a pure. They talked about Tony Blair. I mean, there's our Tony Blair, carbon copy, pretty much. Um, but we're a small nation. We have resources that other people want, and we're caught between two empires, basically. So we have to ally with someone, which caught me in a bit of hot water. Uh, we talked about my appearance yesterday on Unpopular Opinions when I angered some of the Americans by saying that, if the Americans get out of my country, that's a good thing, and I can't really care about anything else. Now, obviously, I'm talking about the GAE. I really hope that, the good guys over in America, you guys are going to be able to work this out somehow. But until that happens, the less gay stuff America pumps into my culture, the better.
It's interesting. So I've committed a faux pas in our circles, and actually started watching the Amazon Lord of the Rings series. And I have a point here. This isn't just me waffling on my viewing habits. And it actually came out incidentally after I reread, all of Tolkien. And to me, it's this odd like complete misread where Tolkien is so good in kind of recognizing the kind of like legitimate human diversity, right? Like, okay, fair
Mhm.
enough, there are men. Well, but the Rohirrim and the Gondorians, like they're different. They have a different culture. There are things like their language, their music, the way they dress are all described and differentiated, right? Like there's a legitimate
It's a very
cultural.
European way of looking at race, if you can put it like that.
Yes, yeah, yeah. It's more
Or
ethnos
ethnicity,
than,
or yeah,
yes,
yeah,
than it is the kind of like American or South African conception of race, if you see what I'm going for.
exactly. Yeah,
Where it's literally just like it's like the Family Guy meme, where it's like okay, not okay, like which is a very
yeah.
different
The
conception.
colors. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. We went from Tolkien to Family Guy in what, 3 sentences? But
it's pretty good.
but it's so odd to me that in this kind of like celebration of the kind of like legitimate human diversity has now been turned into this like globo homo kind of just like legitimate, just like gray slush of like every group is made up of people who look like they could belong to any other group, right? Like there's other than how tall they are, there's legitimately no difference.
Yeah, yeah.
And
It's the hunt for the mono consumer culture, right?
right, exactly, like the perfect interchangeable bug man. And to me at least, that's kind of like one big reason I don't know, I do kind of support this kind of like European anti-Americanism, because like look, like I want Norway to be Norwegian. I'm not going to pretend like I know a great deal about the culture. Like any Amerimut, I think I'm probably, I have one grandfather who's Norwegian, but I mean, what does that mean, right? I have
The
no
joke
connection.
goes that there are more Norwegian descendants in Minnesota than there are Norwegians in Norway. So,
That's probably true.
yeah,
The people there did one thing, and that was have an astonishing amount of children who were,
yep.
particularly good at making cheese. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the point is, like, it, it's this kind of, at least to me, like, it is a little bit depressing to kind of see like everything, much like even Tolkien's own work. Like the Distributist was talking about, when Saruman became evil and became mechanized, he traded out his white cloak, his one color
Mm,
specific cloak, for a rainbow cloak. It had a little bit of everything
yep.
in it, and in that it became gray. Which I think is to a certain extent, like that is kind of the truth behind the true, like global homogenization. And to me, you even see it in America, right? Because and I noted this, like, look, I have the soulless American college accent, right? Like realistically, my accent, other than a few, I say y'all, I have a few, Southern syntax. Like I could be from anywhere, And then I talk to
Right.
people like my grandfathers, my great grandfathers, and they sound like someone from the middle of nowhere, Virginia, where they're from. And to me, it does make me sad to see that kind of like go by the wayside. And this, I can tie this back into the New Atheist, right? Like it was always the thing that just even as a kid absolutely bothered me about this like drive for like standardization and rationalization of like, and you see this in like the Reddit attitude towards the metric system, you know,
Yeah.
where it's it's
Yeah.
it's it's not the biggest deal. Like, look, like I know how the metric system works. I know how the imperial system works. It's not that difficult, cognitively. But it's that idea that like, oh, everything has to be the same. And look, it makes sense. It's rational. And I don't
It's
know. But it's also
people
soulless when
blame the
everyone.
Americans, but I would say goes further back than that. And here's sort of my hot take on all of this. it's not the Americans themselves that are the fault of this. It's, it comes from the French, it comes from the Germans, who just can't help themselves but try to, you know, take over Europe every now and then, and the French especially with the rationalism. And
Well, and
they
I
exported that to America, who then sort of lost control of it and unleashed this, beast upon Europe again. And now here we are. I mean, it's not necessarily you guys' fault. You just lost control of it.
well, no, I agree, and it's why I think that the description of like European civilization as Faustian is particularly apt. It was kind of we were almost stuck in this like internal, but actually it was a literal arms race in many cases, but also just this kind of like we opened Pandora's box and there was no way to stop it along the way.
Yeah.
And to me, it's a useful microcosm of this. Incidentally, is James Lindsay, where it's this idea that like, well, okay, I like the version of, or I like where the tiger was, 30 years ago. But the problem is when you have a tiger by the tail, you're not in control. You're riding it.
No.
It is
Yeah.
taking you one way. And that's, I guess, kind of the truth behind, like Moldbug's conception of the left as entropy, right? Where it's like you can't have really a little bit of entropy. And I think the big question is like, well, if we've decided to get rid of entropy, like how radical is that? Like do we go back to serfdom? And I'm honestly like not really sure what the answer is there.
No, me neither. And about your point about the particularism, I think, and I've always said that whatever the American expression of that, and whatever the Norwegian and the British expression of that is, it has to be just that. If monarchy is the way to go for Britain to stop this entropy, then that's it. If going back to to something similar or all across Europe is the way to go, then that's it. But maybe the Norwegians want to do something different from the Brits and the Americans, but that's up to them because it's their biospirit, it's their, soil and their spirit,
No, that's
and
well
it is
said.
different.
It is, and I think that there's kind of a problem because in the American context, like the term white actually kind of made sense, right? And Thomas talks about this where it's like, and this is not a moral claim; it's merely a factual one. Like America was kind of born of a series of just horrible race wars, right? And look, like I don't say that like yes, race wars are good. Like no, they're not good. They're specifically awful, because there's no common cultural context, and so it's essentially wars of extermination.
Yeah.
And when that's the kind of like mode you're in, having a very easy binary white non-white like way of looking at it kind of actually makes sense. Like it's a useful thing to have. But the problem is like that model doesn't translate as well, back on the continent, right? Like you
No,
can't
and
really like
that's why you get
lecture.
the 2016 meme of, the right saying, well, Europe doesn't have race, we hate on ethnicity. Right?
Well,
I
it's
don't
true. Yeah, it's this thing where it's like, and a lot of people in our circles with Lady of Shalott have been talking a lot about the Troubles, and from an American context, it's like trying to break this down into the two ways we have of looking through the world, which is either the Jim Crow South or the mid 20th century Germans. Like you can't put everything into those two kind of like limited
no, that's the two
moral
boxes
boxes.
you have. Yeah. Yeah, and I have some thoughts about that. um, we're probably gonna have to talk about the mid-century Germanisms at some point. We'll get to it when we get to it, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm actually that's one of the things I'm curious about. So I know that there were, and I'm not going to pretend I'm a scholar on this, right? But can you, given I guess like Norway's involvement in the Second World War, like what did the Nuremberg regime, to kind of use Thomas's framing, like
Mm.
what did that do to the right in Norway? Did it change its character?
Yes. And I'll give you, I suppose, my You invoke Thomas 777, so I'll try to give my Thomas 777 inspired take on this. It's a bit of an this is going to be an off-the-cuff explanation. I'm going to gloss over details. It's a gross oversimplification. I'm saying it because you're going to get comments, right, from the history autists. But I'm going to try to weave like a narrative here. And that is, let's start in 1905, which is when Norway finally freed itself from the grip of the eternal Swede and the Dane by proxy. Talking about ethnicity once again.
It's funny
And
you bring
after
that up because my fiance's family is all ethnically Swedish, and I'll be perfectly honest. I know very little about kind of history in your neck of the woods. I'm an American. What can I say? I don't know geography. But
right,
it's interesting because the one thing that her very typically progressive Swedish grandmother said to me out of nowhere is that Norwegians are dirty and they smell bad. And she said that with complete and total conviction, which was, I thought, kind of funny, but carry on.
she has pretty much every reason to believe that. I mean, prior to striking oil, our exports were fishing and mining. So, I mean, we've been drunk fishermen for years, and before that, we were Vikings. That's pretty much, if you want to, in a nutshell, our history in a bit of a meme way.
No, that's well said, and I.
But yeah, it's 1905. We're finally free to forge our own destiny, I suppose. And at this point, we have had for quite a long time quite good relations with a lot of the continental powers, and especially Germany. High culture in Norway was for a very long time German, meaning that you spoke German, you went to German universities. Vienna was sort of the big place to go if you wanted to be like engineer or something like that. So and a lot of our greatest authors and poets, etc., studied in Germany or in Denmark and stuff like that. So we had quite a good relationship with the continent, but our relationship to Britain was a bit rougher. Mostly starting with their wars with Denmark, going even further back, when we were under Denmark, made that we got hit quite hard by the British, trade blockades and food blockades, etc. And in the modern times when we're going it alone, there's disputes over fishing rights and miscellaneous matters of economics with the British. And as I said back then, all we had was fishing and mining, and the Brits are basically forcing us away from that. So a lot of people were very mad at Britain during this time. And if you fast forward to 1930s, suddenly these guys in Germany are starting to get a bit uppity, and they're saying some weird stuff about us being heirs to the Hyperborean Empire or something, which is a bit weird. But their policies are very sensible to a lot of Norwegians at this time. And a lot of them agree with their general sentiments. So a similar party is formed in Norway. And its leader is Quisling, as has become a word basically in the wake of that. And there's some movement towards maybe Norway can do its own version of this, right? Maybe we can find a third position, as it's called. And then the Germans and the Brits start rattling their sabers at each other, as they tend to do every 100 years from our perspective, or the continent and the Brits. And they're gearing up for war in the 1940s, or late 1930s, early 1940s. And the Brits are planting mines all along our coastline. This is before any sort of real war is starting. And they're performing aerial operations in our airspace. Like, people are there's a ton of stories of people talking about seeing airplanes flying over, thinking they were Germans, and then later discovering that the markings are British, because there were fears, of course, that Germany's going to invade. So basically, the British are taunting the Germans to come get us, because we have a lot of resources that Germany and Britain would want in a war. And eventually, of course, the Germans do. We are one of the earliest targets of Germany in 1941. Now, I think to the average Norwegian, you've been free for barely a generation. We're just starting to get used to doing our own thing. And these Germans basically show up on our doorstep saying, we're here to take over your country, and you don't really have a say in it. And also something about Hyperborea. I'm memeing a bit here, but you can see the sentiment is kind of weird. That being said, a lot of stories, it goes both ways. Some stories of German occupation in Norway are negative. A lot of stories are positive. My own grandmother, who lived in a very rural place, told me that when the Germans arrived quite late in the war, they were very cordial. People would get a notice saying, you're going to be housing a German soldier. He's going to show up tomorrow, and you're going to provide him with a bed. And he'd show up. He'd fold his clothes neatly. He'd leave everything the way he found it. Perfectly cordial. No one disliked the Germans in that way out in the countryside. So as for how brutal the occupation itself was, it goes both ways, and I'm sure there's an equal amount of stories in any other country that was occupied. But what's interesting is that despite this, it turns out that, and here's probably where I'm going to get a lot of flack, but from my perspective, it turns out that in the Third Reich, there isn't really a room for a Norwegian identity. So what choice do you have but to oppose it, really? If you're a people that finally got your freedom back, you're a people who are naturally kind of stubborn. I hesitate to use the word libertarian, but they're stubborn, go walk their own sort of road. I'm going to go out into the forest and build my own, homestead and do my own thing type of people. And you're being told that you can't do that anymore. You got to go along with this German project. Opposition is pretty much the only option. And so we went with the Brits, right? And post World War II, the cleanup of that decision is quite swift. There's executions of some of the top guys of the National Socialist Party of Norway. But what really tips the scales into the Nuremberg regime, if you want to call it that, or the GIE, is our accept of the Marshall Plan and our NATO membership. And this is one of those truth regime things where before I looked into it, you take it as a given, but this was something that was very strongly debated back in the day in post-war Norway. And everyone understood that, accepting the Marshall Plan, accepting NATO membership, we're basically, hitching our cart to America. We're going to become a vassal state. And even to the point where the labor leader, sort of this old guard socialist worker type, who ended up accepting the Marshall Plan, and he was the prime minister at the time, he used to get death threats for decades, and had his life in danger from like communists for accepting the Marshall Plan. But that was sort of the final nail in the coffin. I mean, the floodgates were open for Americanism after that. Sorry, I went on a bit of a rant. Hopefully that paints a picture.
It does. What did the that's interesting. That it is. it was kind of, to a certain extent, the Marshall Plan was kind of like the devil's bargain, right? Like on one hand,
Yes,
well,
it was.
it, I don't know, and to me, I always do wonder, because I think that it's all too easy to kind of like paint these, these people who essentially signed on the dotted line out to be monsters. But I do always kind of idly wonder, like, what would they have thought if you showed them, like, oh, here's what happens, 30, 40, 50 years down the line, like, would they still have signed? And that's one of those cases, like, obviously you'll never know, like, it happened. But I do wonder in cases like
Yeah,
that, where you essentially kind of, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth here, but you kind of like truly kind of like signed away your independence.
yeah. No, we did. And what baffled me was how clear the understanding was in the, public debate at the time that this is basically what we're doing. And you can say there are a million reasons why, and there's no point, as you said, in doing what ifs, but I don't know if that, man Garretson, as he's called, died thinking he did the right thing or not. That's I mean, we're never going to know, but it's a haunting thought, really.
No, it is. I'm curious. So what is and maybe this is a lot to ask of you in a short amount of time, but so post World War II, right? The National Socialist Party of Norway obviously got, purged, its leaders executed, as kind of was, typical. But how did the right coalesce after that? Like, did it kind of follow the mold of, the Anglosphere, where it's essentially, you know, like 10 liberal policies from 10 years ago, or did it have a more specific identity?
No, it pretty much did. I mean, what's interesting is that the right in Norway pretty much collapsed after that, and it was a pure sort of labor uh, led state for many, many years. Um, and it was borderline communist. Um, and it's a strange kind of thing because Norway has always been an incredibly high trust society. Doing doing something for your community for free is a regular occurrence here. So things you would name communist sort of sensibilities is something that we have built in, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're all leftists, right? It just means that we have a very high trust society and we care about each other, and it's a small country. So it's this very strange mix between these sort of right wing, I would say, Christian themes of helping your local community, mixing with socialist idea, which worked out for quite a while. But eventually, there was in the 70s and 80s, there was a drift towards more. We had basically our own sort of mini Thatcher moment, and some more sort of opening for trade and culture from the outside world, which, looking back at it now, I would say, if you ask me like 7 years ago, I'd probably say that that's good. But now I'm thinking, well, I mean, who really sold us out to to the modern version of the GAE? It was probably the conservatives, or the right, as they're called.
Well, and I think that that's been kind of I think the pill that a lot of people have had to swallow over the last, I really like post Trump at least, which is that essentially, like, if we're going to get out of this, like, there are enemies too. The kind of like the
Yeah,
normal right. They're essentially really less so in America than elsewhere. Like, they're the ones kind of driving this. Really, I think you see it most cleanly in the UK, right? Like, because their Conservative Party, essentially, they are the government. But it is kind of
yeah.
like those are the people kind of pushing that, like, massive, just like deracination that's kind of like eating us all, from the outside in. So
And
I'm
they've become,
no, carry
it's
on.
something we're blessed with a little bit because we don't have a two-party system, so we don't get it as bad. But looking at the UK, I mean, how incredibly potent the Tories are at, maintaining the Overton window. Um, it's scary, really.
it's interesting what you said about kind of like the communitarian like nature of life in Norway. And tell me if I'm completely off base here, but it always does just kind of stick in my mind that like there's a certain amount of individualism you can kind of get away with if your material conditions are good enough. Like, look, like if you live in Aruba, you don't really need, as strong of a community because it's lovely out all the time, and food is
Yes.
relatively plentiful. Whereas if, you live in, uh, a frost blasted hellhole, to, to put it gently, like you kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
have to be nice to your neighbors because
Yeah, you
if you're
do.
not, you have a very real material chance of just not surviving.
Yes. And
And so I wonder if, and this is, I guess, a bigger concept of essentially like if the kind of like cascading like series of preferences that is led us here, right? Like no one's telling you, don't have kids till you're 35, get on dating apps, send your parents to die in a home. It's just the easier, more convenient thing to do, right?
mm,
And so I almost wonder if we kind of build our way back to those kind of like healthy, more communitarian values when they become material necessities again. Because when I look at where they came from, these kind of like core human institutions, the reason they were around for so long is they were essentially like necessary for survival. And so I guess maybe that's the maybe that's how we get out of this, is our material conditions sink so far that we just need them again.
I've always said that, with the current events going on, and regular people being pressured materially, with energy prices and everything else, it leads naturally to right-wing thought, because having to think about how am I going to survive the next winter is a right-wing thought, and it leads to right-wing answers.
Well, it reminds me very much of what kind of Todd Lewis has been talking about on his Praise of Folly podcast, which is that like, look, like we've essentially done, and he's specifically talking about like monetary stuff. So things like debt. It's like, look, like we've essentially built our entire lives on privileging the future against, or privileging the present against the future. Essentially like, well, I'll pay it off later. And we've done that
Yeah,
kind of everywhere. And there's a certain extent to which that's an advantage. It's a nice to have that as kind of like a tool in the tool chest. But it's become much like you were kind of talking about, like the whatever, like the Faustian, philosophy that kind of like ran away, in France and Germany, America, and in the UK. It's like we're kind of stuck with the same thing, both philosophically and kind of socially, and also monetarily. Where we kind of found this useful technique to get us out of the top, or get us out of a hard space. But you know much like the guy with the hammer, everything looks like a nail, and now it's to the point where we're
yeah,
using that hammer to you know essentially repair grandma's urn.
exactly. Yes, taking out a loan on everything, and the sad reality is, I mean, as with the economy, the money isn't real, right? You're just passing the loan along to someone else, really.
And that's, I guess, a good way to describe it, which and I know you were on UO last night talking about the Dark Brandon speech. But I think, to me, the one of the things that's been particularly kind of disturbing is realizing that kind of like the people in charge are legitimately convinced this goes on forever. Like the way that they're acting is not, it does not indicate that they think that this is ever going to run out. The game will just continue forever. And I guess to me, it seems like very apparent that this cannot go on forever. Like it seems like we are already running out of the energy necessary to do it. But it is a little bit, I guess, disturbing to see the people allegedly in charge, kind of like still stuck in
It
a
feels
very
very
limited
strange
framework.
because it's not just the money that we're running out of. It's the energy, as in literally the energy, but it's also in sort of a spiritual energy as well. I mean, how long? I didn't get to make this point yesterday, but so I can use this platform to say it. Um, how long can the regime, quote unquote, in the U.S. keep its citizens in high alert mode politically? It's like, I don't want to make light of war, but I'm sure you talked about before we started, having a lot of family members who are veterans, and they talk about soldiers in Afghanistan, the PTSD doesn't necessarily come from one event. It's from being on high alert all the time for 5 years or something, right? And that effect, I think, has a toll on a populace when you do it politically. How long can they go on with, the next week we're gonna really bring down Trump, or he's gonna take over the country, or something like that? I mean, they've been doing it for almost 6 years already, and people are getting crazy, right?
No, I think people are like manifestly going crazy. And I think that's one of the other things that worries me is it's not just the consistency of it, it's also the intensity. So like, okay, fair enough. First it's, hey, guess what? There are some neo-Nazis somewhere in Charlottesville. Like there's some of them.
Right.
That's a big problem. And then it's, oh wait, here's the shadowy alt-right. They're behind every bush. And then it's, oh, there's, like there's this crazy, there's this like crazy contingency of I can't remember who the boogeyman was back. Oh, it's Proud Boys. Then it's the Proud Boys.
Right.
Then it's the Q-tards. And now it is essentially 40% of America. And that
Yeah, the
idea of like
MAGA Republicans, or what he called them. Yeah.
right. Yeah. And so to me, it's I don't really think that they are taking this seriously, which on one hand is good because I don't really think that they're actually going to send, F-15s to carpet bomb rural Alabama, which is good. I don't want that. But there's another
No.
part which is like, I'm kind of terrified that they're not taking this seriously. That like, look, like this isn't just a button you can press forever. Eventually
Yeah.
that tension, as it ramps up, like things will start to crack. I think we've already seen that. And maybe the things that start to crack are just kind of like the crazy people on the like kind of peripheries of society, right? Like the Bernie shooter who shot up those
Sure, but that's going to move further and further in the longer you go, right?
right,
And
which
at
is the
some
point I'm
point,
going
someone's going
towards.
to call their bluff, right?
Yeah, and it's, to me, I guess it's just disturbing that much much like debt or anything else, they feel like they can keep pressing this button and keep like pumping the tire full of more and more air, and it'll never burst.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I
we're
don't know.
coming up. Oh, sorry.
It's
Yeah, I mean, me either, right?
it's
Like, it's why I'm asking it as a question.
yeah. No, it's certainly, it's an interesting show to watch, and I hope that it gets resolved with as little violence as possible, but it's hard to feel anything other than whatever is happening is putting America on or the US, sorry, on a track to either a secession or a civil war
Yeah,
of some
I don't
sort.
like, to me, it just doesn't seem like there's an off ramp. Like I don't understand what the move is to diffuse the pressure. Like, okay, maybe there
There
is
might
one.
be something, and it might be the greatest, trick ever played if they manage to put the genie back in the bottle, as it were. And I'll applaud them for that. But I mean, we're not going to forget. Maybe the average Joe is going to go back to watching football and forget about Trump and Brandon, but we're not. I mean, it's too late for me. I can't go back.
Well, right. Like I was even thinking about this, where it's like after everything that happened with COVID, like I don't know, like it would have to be really serious and very observable for me to really believe in any other like health crisis. Like they could literally tell me like, oh, hey, there's a disease that if you catch it will make you just instantly explode, instant death, horrible. And after everything that happened, I just couldn't believe them. Like even if I had, mountains of, testimony firsthand, whatever, like the trust is lost. And look, I get it. Like, I'm not trying to say like, oh, well, so many people will believe that they're wrong. We'll get 51% and we'll vote in, like based right wing Caesar. That's not my point. My point is just that like these people are essentially supporting themselves, keeping themselves afloat by shredding social capital. And
Yes.
I don't know how much more there is to shred. I'll put it that way.
Mm. Yeah. No, it's again, I don't know how long this can go on, which means that there was some discussion about the Brandon speech, being sort of counter-signaled by the mainstream media, which I think is them trying to ramp down a bit and them trying to possibly set the stage for a bit more of a return to normalcy campaign in 2024, because certainly whoever is on the teams in the White House isn't doing that right now. Whoever's handling Joe. And it remains to be seen if it's too late or if they can pull it off, really.
My one hope, and maybe this is a white pill buried in this to kind of bring things to a close, is I do kind of hope that as the empire kind of turns inward to kind of domestic disputes, I do legitimately hope that our kind of like outward colonies start to break off. Like, and this is kind of what we were saying before we started rolling. Like this, we kind of forget like this empire has not been good for America. Like it's been disastrous economically. It's been disastrous from like a standpoint of just like we've sent our our best and brightest to essentially die in in border skirmishes that have not materially improved the conditions of the average American. And so to me, it's like on one hand, it's like, yeah, look, I like my country. I want my country to win. If we were good at soccer, I'd probably be there at every World Cup cheering for us. Sorry, football. But to me, it's like I kind of maybe it's kind of good that the American empire is kind of falling apart. Maybe we can return to kind of a multipolar world, where the rules of the game make a little bit more sense. If you see what I'm going for.
Yeah, I mean, as strange as this is going to sound, the USSR managed a peaceful decline, so we'll see, right? But what I do know is that in the instability of the empire, there is more wiggle room in the cracks that are starting to show for people like me on the periphery, and it's good to be aware of it and try to be ready.
Well, anyway, man, thank you so much for coming out. I really enjoyed talking to you. Before we wrap this up, do you have any plugs you want to get out of the way?
Sure. Of course, obviously, my channel here, A Walrus, is the same name on YouTube. I go by the same name on Twitter as well, if you want to follow me there. Every Thursday night, we usually do a stream called the Longhouse, where we discuss various topics, which we find interesting. It's usually not a show up and just hang out kind of stream, but we do encourage people to hang out sort of with us. But we like to bring something of note, so we'll either do a stream specifically on someone like Sam Harris, or we'll talk about a history topic or something like that. So check it out and see if you're interested.
And I give Walrus my full wholehearted endorsement. I've been watching his streams a lot over the last couple of weeks, and I've really gotten a lot from him. My links as well as his will be down in the description. I have a Telegram. I'd really appreciate if you guys would join that. And remember, guys, the lie can't last forever. Keep your head up. Good night, everyone.